Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. My name is Roland Paris, Director of the Center for International Policy Studies, and I want to welcome everyone to this debate on whether Canada should adopt mandatory voting. As many of you know, undoubtedly, this is the second time we've attempted to hold this debate. The first time, unfortunately, Andrew Coyne was unable to attend. He was actually on his way to Ottawa when his plane turned around midair to head back to Toronto. At least that's the story he told us. But jokes aside, we're delighted to have both Andrew and Dawn here tonight. I'd like to apologize to all of you who tried to attend our September event. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for coming back. The idea for this debate was actually sparked by a column that Andrew wrote in the National Post last May, I think it was, and by a very thoughtful reply by Dawn Lenahan 2 days later. Since then, there's been quite a lot of interest in this subject. My colleague here at the University of Ottawa, Robert Asselin, has written on the subject. Unfortunately, he right now is in a train coming back from Montreal, so he can't join us today. So also writing on the subject has been Dawn Lenahan's partner, the Toronto Star columnist Susan Delacourt, who's here with us tonight. I hope, Susan, that you'll also have a chance to weigh in during the discussion period. Finally, I have the pleasure to introduce the moderator for tonight's event, a woman who is used to sorting out competing arguments and perhaps also used to dealing with strongly opinionated people, Kate Heartfield, the opinion editor of the Ottawa Citizen, where she's also been a columnist and an editorial writer since 2004. We're delighted that Kate has agreed to do this, and I'd like to ask all of you now to welcome her to the stage.
So I am the moderator for this evening's event. This is how it's going to go. We'll start with 10 minutes each of opening statements from Andrew Coyne and Dawn Lenahan, and then they'll each have a brief chance to respond. And then I'll ask a few questions and we'll have a moderated conversation up here. And then there will be a 30-minute period for audience questions. So if you have a question, hold on to it in your mind, and when the time comes, please go to one of the microphones because we are filming the session, and links to that film will be available. I guess video would be the thing to say in 2014. Links to that video will be available afterwards. It's my pleasure to introduce the two debaters this evening. Dawn Lenahan is a senior associate at the Public Policy Forum. He recently served as chair for Ontario's Open Government Engagement Team. His latest book is Rescuing Policy, The Case for Public Engagement. He earned his PhD in political theory at the U of O. Andrew Coyne's columns appear in the National Post and across the Post media chain, including in my section at the Citizen. And he's written just about everywhere and is also a longtime regular on the At Issue panel on CBC's The National. And on a personal note, his columns have taught me a great deal about clear writing and clear thinking. So it's a very great pleasure for me to be here tonight with the two of them. So to begin, I'll invite Andrew to the stage to make his opening remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Kate, and thank you, Roland, and thank you, Dawn. It is a little daunting, I must say, to be sharing the stage with probably Canada's greatest living authority on citizen engagement. So while my plane did, in fact, turn around in midair, it's possible that I may have willed it to do so in a means of putting off the inevitable. Let me say off the top that there's a tendency in these debates to take these things to the absolute end of things. People want to know if it's going to fix everything or not fix everything. So let me just be clear on this. What I'm proposing is not a cure-all. Mandatory voting is not going to fix everything that is wrong with our democracy. But it can, I'll argue, make a modest contribution to improving it. What is the problem that it is trying to solve? It can be stated very simply: low and falling voter turnout. At the federal level, voter turnout has fallen from an average of roughly 75% in the 6 elections after 1945 to a little more than 60% in the last 6. Turnout in provincial elections is even worse, a roughly 20% decline on average, some provinces 30% over the last 40 years. It's now in the mid-50s. Municipal turnouts, even lower. Yes, some will say, but is that a problem, really? I find this question perplexing, I have to say. Democracy's promise, the right it guarantees to each adult citizen, is one person, one vote. If half or more of the citizens are not exercising that right, it's surely at least disappointing. And yet you'll hear some assert that this is actually a sign of democratic strength, a reflection of popular satisfaction with the choices on offer. To which my reply is, how do you know this? There's plenty of evidence to the contrary. Poll after poll has shown declining satisfaction with the democratic system. When asked why they don't vote, people don't, in fact, say, it's because I'm so pleased with the choices available to me. They say things like, the parties are all the same, all politicians are liars, the system is broken. And of course, they're right. Part of the reason for this sad state of affairs is that so few people vote or pay attention to politics, as they must if the players are to be held to account. We're caught in a vicious circle. The worse it gets, the less we care, and the less we care, the worse it gets. We need to do something to turn this around. Low voter turnout, I'll argue, is not simply a sign of deeper problems within the system. It's a problem in itself. I don't actually need to know the reasons why people don't vote to argue that it's a problem that they don't. It's enough that they don't. Because when large numbers of people don't vote, the result is an unrepresentative sample of popular opinion. The portion of the population that chooses to vote is not a random sample of the whole. It's skewed to certain social and demographic groups, older, whiter, better off. More than that, it's skewed to the people the parties focus their Get Out the Vote programs on. Target demographics, certainly, but also key regions, swing ridings, right down to the level of the individual voter, who I assure you they have profiled up the yin-yang. Turnout today is largely a function of the parties, identifying the sorts of voters likely to be attuned to the party's message, finding them, advertising to them, motivating them, if necessary, driving them to the polls. The voters don't choose the parties anymore so much as the parties choose them. That may be rational for the parties. It is not rational from the standpoint of democracy. We're no longer governing for the greatest good of the greatest number, but a highly stratified, arbitrarily selected number. The argument for mandatory voting, then, is akin to that, if I may bring up an old controversy, for the mandatory long-form census. You get a more representative sample of the population. Not only that, but you eliminate a lot of the ills associated with a party-selected electorate. If everybody votes every election, turnout ceases to be the dominant factor that it is today. There's no more need for the parties to pour such efforts into getting out the vote, or for that matter, to depressing other parties' support. With no more get out the vote, there's no need for all the intrusive and expensive machinery that goes into it, the robocalling and all the rest, and the fundraising that supports that. Fine, but maybe you're one of those people who don't vote. Maybe you don't mind not being represented. Isn't that your right? But voting in an election isn't just about you. It's about what you think. When you're picking between, say, Coke and Pepsi, that's about you. It's a purely individual preference. But we're not choosing between Coke or Pepsi. We vote on things collectively that have to do with the collective, that involve collective judgments, things like justice and fairness and good government. That's not a purely self-regarding individual matter. It's your contribution to the general good. Put simply, you owe your fellow citizens your counsel. And here the best analogy is probably jury duty, or that other great civic obligation, paying your taxes. Left to themselves, some will do so out of a sense of obligation, but others won't, precisely because they know the others will. It's called free riding, and there's ample precedent for a mild, limited degree of compulsion to correct it. We ask very few things of citizens in a free society. Obey the laws, pay your taxes, serve on juries. Would it be such a great imposition to add vote to that list? And yet that's the first objection that springs to people's lips. The inalienable right not to vote. That sacred liberty for which our fathers and our grandfathers fought in 2 world wars. Oh, please. What sort of intrusion on your freedom is really entailed here? Show up at your local church or elementary school for about 5 minutes every 4 years. Before long, it will be lean over and click on your computer. It's not that big a deal. Mandatory voting does not mean you have to vote for a particular party or for any party at all, for that matter. That's not the practice in any of the nearly 24 countries where it's the law. You can still spoil your ballot or decline it or vote none of the above, or otherwise register your dissatisfaction. The only thing you can't do is sit on your duff. There are typically sensible exceptions made if you're sick or disabled or traveling or otherwise have a good excuse. You face enforcement measures that are comparatively mild. In Australia, it's a $20 fine. It's almost never assessed, and almost everyone who is fined pays it. The number who actually go to court to fight it is less than 1%. And yet turnout in Australian elections regularly exceeds 90%. So it's more in the nature of a nudge, to use a vogue word, than a penalty, a reminder that, hey, there's an election on. You should vote. Everybody else is voting. The other common objection, I would say, is even less credible. Make it mandatory, some will say, and you'll get a lot of ignorant, uninformed people voting. There are two answers to this. One is an observation. Those currently participating in the democratic process are not necessarily a bunch of Einsteins. Remember, voting is a function of the parties. The ones who vote are not necessarily the best informed, but the best groomed. The ones the parties target, the ones most susceptible to their propaganda. The gullible, the partisan, the self-interested, and the fanatic are all, I assure you, heavily overrepresented. Voting is objectively irrational. Even the small amount it takes is hardly worth the infinitesimal impact a single vote is likely to have on the result. If it's rational to vote, to not vote, it follows that the most rational people are the ones not voting. By compelling them to vote, you're arguably improving the quality of the voting pool. But that's in passing. The real answer to those who worry that mandatory voting would let the riffraff in is, listen to yourself. Voting is not something reserved for the well-educated and the well-informed. If it was, we'd have literacy tests. It's for everybody. For people on the margins, the kind of people this casual sneer is directed at, the ones with less education or access to media, the ones who've been told all their lives they don't count, their opinions don't matter. It's the one day every 4 years when people have to listen to them. That so many of them don't take advantage of that opportunity is a tragedy, not just for them, but for all of us. People may not know a lot about the intricacies of public policy, but they have a pretty good idea of how their own lives are working out and those of their neighbors. And they know a thing or two about those values questions I was talking about, what is just, what is fair, and they're very good at judging character. They not only have a right to express their views on these questions, but an obligation, because we benefit as a society when they do. Our collective judgments are broader, fairer, and better informed. Young people aren't voting now. Are we a better society for that, with no input from the people who will inherit it? Poor people aren't voting now. Are we a better society for that, when the very measure of a society is how it looks after its worst off? Aboriginal people aren't voting now. Are we a better society for that? Can we really say that we know what's best for Aboriginal people? How's that working out for anybody? So yes, low turnout is a problem. Would mandatory voting fix it? Yes, unambiguously. The international evidence on turnout is clear. Countries with mandatory voting have substantially higher turnouts, on the order of 10 to 15%. In Australia, turnout leapt from 58%, about where we are now, to more than 90% the first time it was tried in the 1924 election. It's stayed there ever since. Again, is mandatory voting all that's needed? No. Shouldn't we also be giving people more positive reasons to vote? You betcha. In addition to mandatory voting, not in place of it. No other single reform would be likely to have as immediate, as large, as certain, and as lasting an impact on turnout at so little relative cost. And it's for that reason that I think the resolution should stand. Thank you very much.
Don Lenahan, you're up.
Greetings. I'm delighted to see you all here today, and thank you so much for coming out. I also want to take the time to thank Roland Paris for the kind invitation to participate, and of course to Kate for generously agreeing to moderate, and for Andrew for showing up the second time. Now, although I'm arguing against mandatory voting, it is not because I think this infringes on personal freedom, as many people argue. Andrew has already done a fine job of answering them, so I will leave it at that. Like him, I regard the question as more practical. Do the benefits outweigh the costs? In my view, they do not. To make the case, I want to start by looking at two key arguments in favor of mandatory voting, then go on to say why I think the reasons for opposing it are much stronger. Let me start with what I call the apathy view. People in the political establishment often say young people don't vote because they are apathetic or ignorant or both. In this view, youth needs some help to set them on the right path. Mandatory voting provides a nudge that should help them develop the right voting habits and mature into responsible citizens. Now, while I agree there's apathy out there, I think this is far too simplistic. For one thing, there are lots of other and possibly better ways to nudge youth to vote, such as education, get-out-the-vote programs, or e-voting. Why the fix on mandatory voting? My deeper objection, however, is that study after study concludes that young people actually aren't that apathetic. Many are public-spirited, want to contribute to society, and care about their fellow citizens. The real issue is that they don't see traditional politics as relevant or as an effective way to pursue the issues they care about. This poses a question. If youth don't find politics relevant, who is at fault? Are they failing the political establishment, or is it failing them? I want you to think about this for a bit. I'm going to come back to it at the end. My second argument for mandatory voting is what I call the fairness view. Youth are not the only voting group, as Andrew has noted, with low turnout. Aboriginal people and people living in poverty also tend to stay home. As a result, party platforms pay less attention to these groups. Why bother to court the vote if they don't show up at the polls? By contrast, political parties do court groups that have a high turnout rate, such as seniors. The result, say some observers, is unfairness in policymaking. Seniors get more than their share, while non-voting groups like youth get less. Mandatory voting is supposed to fix this by putting these unused votes into play. If candidates know that youth or Aboriginal people have to vote, they'll be far more likely to propose policies that court them. Over time, this will change the mix and result in greater fairness. I must admit that I find this line of argument intriguing, and I do think there's something to it. Andrew seems to suggest the same in his comments on representativeness. But in the end, I think the fairness view promises much more than it can ever deliver. Consider the appalling rates of unemployment, incarceration, income, illness, mortality, and suicide among Aboriginal people. Most of us would agree that somewhere the policy making has gone horribly wrong. But does anybody really believe that forcing these people to vote will lead to a significant realignment of the policies behind this tragedy? I don't. The issue of unfairness here has very deep roots in the political system, and it will take a lot more than mandatory voting to resolve them. So how much difference would mandatory voting make? To be fair, the jury is still out. Maybe we can discuss this, but I'm not very optimistic. And I think most Aboriginal people would feel the same. I think something similar can be said about the fairness argument in youth. When we ask young people why they don't vote, they say things like, "I don't believe it'll make a difference," or "politicians are only in it for themselves." The usual response from the political establishment is that this is naive and uninformed. But is it? When young people turn on the TV or go online, what do they actually see or hear about how politics is being done? They're confronted with hyper-partisan debates, constant campaigning, negative ads, an endless barrage of talking points and spin, policy decisions that get made in a black hole or reflect short-term political gain rather than the public interest, the latest scandal over Rob Ford, Senator Mike Duffy, or sexual impropriety of MPs. Looked at through this lens, it's not hard to see why youth doubt that politics has much to offer them. I don't mind telling you that I keep flirting with this idea myself, truly. Nor do I see any obvious reason to think that mandatory voting will do much to change these practices. Like the issues around Aboriginal unfairness, they have deep roots in the political system. In fact, the growing dysfunction in our politics is part of a long-term trend that appears to be reaching a crisis point. Let me show you a slide that was recently produced by Frank Graves from Ecos Research. The blue and green lines show a stunning drop in the number of Canadians and Americans who trust their national government to do what is right. According to these figures, over the last 50 years, trust has plummeted from a high point of about 78% down into the low 20s here in Canada and into the teens in the US. I think this is the real story behind falling voter turnout. Citizens' willingness to vote is directly linked to their trust in government to do what is right. Voter turnout is declining because people are losing faith in the political system. This should cause us grave concern. If people are not voting, they are not giving their consent, and if they are not giving their consent, they are not legitimizing the electoral process. This has real consequences. A weak mandate makes it harder for a government to implement controversial decisions, such as to send our troops to war, legalize same-sex marriage, or cancel the long-form census. It also explains why mandatory voting has become an issue today. Voter turnout is the key indicator of a government's legitimacy, and it threatens to go into free fall. Mandatory voting looks like a quick and easy way to reverse this trend. It's not. Mandatory voting is a classic case of treating the symptom rather than the cause. To focus our attention on lower voter turnout and then use compulsory participation to artificially raise the numbers. This will solve nothing. The real problem is not the low numbers, but the loss of trust behind the numbers, and mandatory voting does nothing to fix that. On the contrary, artificially high voter turnout is likely to make things worse for at least two reasons. First, it gives the political establishment an excuse to go on with business as usual. Second, it perpetuates the myth that falling voter turnout is the fault of the voters rather than the political establishment. This gets things exactly backwards. The reality is that voter turnout is falling because the political system is broken. Without full clarity on this point, politicians will never find the courage or the will to fix it. Which brings me back to the question I posed at the outset. I said youth don't see politics as relevant, and I ask you to think about who has failed who. I think we know the answer. The central message in falling voter turnout is not about apathy or ignorance or the insularity of First Nations communities. It's about the public's growing contempt for politics as they see it. Recognizing this puts the ball back in the politicians' court. It calls on political parties to stop blaming the public and start asking how to rebuild the relationship, especially with youth. There are no shortcuts here, no silver bullets. The changes needed are far-reaching and will take deep resolve. We've got a long way to go to achieve this, but if we want our democracy to endure, I really don't see that we have a choice. Thank you.
Andrew, do you want to take a few minutes to respond?
Sure. Well, we have what they say in the debating circles is good clash here. We both agree that falling turnout is a problem, but we don't agree what, if anything, should be done about it. And we don't necessarily agree on why it's happening. I just want to note, first of all, the contradiction between the position of some of the people I outlined at the beginning. Colby Kosh, the writer from Maclean's, is one that non-voting is actually a sign of contentment with the status quo, and Don's position that it's a sign of rejection of the status quo. I'm not sure that we actually know a great deal either way. We have some suggestive evidence. I suggest it's a bit of both depending on the situation. We just saw voting go up, for example, in Toronto because people were determined to vote out Rob and then Doug Ford. But I want to put, there's a third option beyond satisfaction with the status quo or rejection of the status quo, and that's indeed sheer laziness and antisocial apathy. I don't actually think this is terribly complicated or controversial. It's the same thing that explains why people don't pay their taxes or why they weasel out of jury duty. It's not always a determined individual choice so much as it's learned behavior, that people take their cues from the people around them. If everybody in your social group, whatever that social group may be, is not voting, chances are you're not going to either. What I'm proposing, as I mentioned, is a kind of a classic nudge to make voting the default from which you can defect if you're really determined to, but which you're most likely to go through once you're there in the polling booth. So I don't think we should necessarily exalt non-voting as some sort of high-minded protest against the system. People who want to express that kind of generalized disdain for politics could still do so even with mandatory voting. They just have to actually do so rather than not doing anything and leaving the rest of us to speculate on exactly why they acted as they did. But I want to take up Don's main position, which is that low turnout is a kind of a useful index of democratic distress, a canary in the coal mine that we should be loath to do without. Without it, as he said, politicians would get the message that would not get the message that there's something wrong with the state of our democracy. They would retreat into complacency. But they've been getting that message for decades, and they haven't done anything about it. If anything, they've been hard at work making it worse, because the lower the turnout, the more turnout becomes the issue in the election. I don't mean turnout in our high-minded democratic sense of we should get it up, but our own party's turnout versus other parties' turnouts. You saw this during the debate on the quote-unquote Fair Elections Act, where the Tories were unapologetically opposed to it on the grounds that Elections Canada's efforts to get out the vote would be prejudicial to their chances. And in a warped, self-serving sense, they were right. But it just shows why we shouldn't leave getting out the vote to the tender mercies of the parties. Politics today, as we know, is about more and more motivating the base. How do the parties do that? By wildly exaggerating the stakes, inflaming their supporters with the terrible crimes the other side has plotted, should the people be so foolish or so negligent as to vote them into power. At the same time, it's about depressing turnout for the other guys, more or less by the same means. And between them, these efforts at manufacturing or massaging turnout, all the millions of dollars that the parties have spent on it, has succeeded in bringing turnout to record lows. Essentially, we've imposed, in place of a literacy test, a motivation test. If you fit the profile desired by one or the other of the parties, you vote. If not, chances are you don't. So that's been the response to Don's canary in the coal mine. Not, oh my goodness, we better do something, but let's make sure our people get out more than their people get out. And the worse it's got, the more that strategic imperative has come to the fore. When turnout is a variable, not a given, but a variable, then difference in turnout between the parties becomes a key factor. It's difficult to see where this ends, where the bottom is. Turnout in the most recent US midterm elections was 36%. Did anyone pause that you saw, the talking heads on TV, did anyone pause more than a second to note that turnout was 36%, or was it all about the Republican wave and the difficulties that this meant for Obama, et cetera? People just treated it as if it was normal. So I don't buy Don's argument that we need to leave a dead canary lying around to spur politicians to fix the system. I see no evidence that it's had that effect. Rather, I think the key is to take turnout out of the strategic equation. Reduce the payoff to vote suppression, and you will get less of it. Final point. It's not either or, just to repeat a point earlier. All of Don's points are well taken, that we should be doing all kinds of things to try to encourage people to get out to vote for positive reasons. But why can't we do that and do this? We can do both at the same time.
Don, would you like to respond?
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, let me echo something that Andrew just said that I think really is important. There are different ways of coming at this. I think there are lots of good arguments in favor of mandatory voting. And in fact, as I was doing the research for this, I had my moments of waffling. Didn't get there, but I had my moments of waffling. So I don't want to deny that there's important things here. That's what makes this debate interesting. But I think if I could say, and Andrew was kind enough to share his piece with me this afternoon. I shared mine with him only after he shared his with me. So it gave me a chance to do a little bit of thinking about what he has to say. And it's interesting. I think there is a clash here. There's a fundamental difference on, we agree upon a lot. I agree with him on the libertarian argument. Frankly, I think someone's liberty can be curbed here without great loss. I certainly agreed on the stupid person argument. There are lots of stupid people out there. There are lots of smart people here. Voting is about values, it's about instincts, it's about intuitions, it's about preferences, it's about judgments. And ordinary citizens are experts at what they believe about the world around them. That's what we ask you to do when you vote. So all that is fine. I think where Andrew and I fundamentally disagree is what is the problem we are actually trying to solve. Frankly, when Andrew says that this is about voter turnout is a problem in itself, I don't get that. I can't make sense out of that. That's like saying protesting is a good thing in itself or a bad thing. Protesting is a vehicle for sending a message. Voting is a tool for communicating two very important things. First of all, consent, and secondly, choice. It's about legitimating the system. It's not just something. It's one of the most, it may be the most fundamental act that we have. So I guess I want to go back to what Andrew said. I want to pick up on a second point that Andrew makes that I think is important, but it seems to me only half the picture. I like the argument about one of the reasons we want mandatory voting is because it creates representativeness. And at the current time, we don't have representativeness. I think that's right. I buy into some of what I called the fairness argument, that some groups are underrepresented and this is not a good thing. And all things being equal, I would say, let's get them to vote to change things. But here's the problem. That's only half of the equation in actually changing what happens. Representativeness in itself, I do public engagement for a living, let me tell you this. We can have a representative group of people in the room, I do it all the time. That is not what gets us to a definition of the public interest, to an understanding of what we want as a community. There's a second part to democracy, it's called dialogue. It's called debate. If we don't have dialogue and debate, you can have all the representativeness in the world you want, and there is no guarantee how that's going to turn out. But that's where I want to say, look at our political culture. How do we actually conduct dialogue and debate in campaigns and every day in politics? The reality is we look at things like wedge issues and all kinds of tactics and advertising and a zillion other things. Do we think that suddenly if we have representativeness out there because of mandatory voting, that that second part is going to be dealt with? That suddenly political parties are going to change their practices and increase evidence and discussion and debate and dialogue? No. The reality is that will just be a signal for them to go on doing exactly what they've been doing increasingly for the last 30 years. Exactly what is wearing at the trust that we have in politics. What we really want them to do is not just for people to show up, but to have a genuine discussion about what it is we are together, about what the evidence is for the choices we make, about the conclusions and trade-offs we make together, about the compromises and the understanding. And there is nothing about mandatory voting that's going to give you that. My argument is that if you get rid of the pressure that we can bring to bear on governments on legitimacy by disguising that, by turning out everybody, there's no longer any pressure for governments to do that. There's no longer any pressure for political parties to do that. I want to say one last thing here before I stop. I spent a lot of time in Australia over the last few years. I had a project there. I traveled the country from one end to the other a number of times. I held lots of meetings with public servants and others from all three levels of government. I admire the Australians. I find them a lot like us. They're great drinkers. They're a lot of fun. But let me tell you this. They got all the same problems that we got about politics except turnout. I could list them for you. Look at their Aboriginal people. Do you think their Aboriginal people are any better off than ours? Do you think their political debates are better than ours? Do you think they're less alienated from their politicians than we are? No. No, they're a lot like us. They are so much like us. They're just missing Quebec, that's all. So all I want to say is this, is I get tired of hearing about Australia and how we should learn from Australians. The only thing Australians have shown us is that they can turn out a higher level of vote, but that changes anything is far from clear. Now they don't even have the indicator to complain about. And believe me, their politicians are not inclined to listen to complaints without some real evidence. So I say, don't give it up. What are we going to gain just by turning out more people?
Okay, thanks very much. So now's the chance for me to ask a question or two. And actually, the question I wanted to ask follows really nicely on what Don was getting at in that his final remarks, which is both Andrew and Don seem to agree that there's a connection of some kind between the substance of our political discourse and turnout. That Andrew's saying if we change the symptom, that could actually affect the cause, the dissatisfaction with the substance of politics. And Don is saying that if we didn't have so much dissatisfaction, the turnout would be different. So it's just a bit of a chicken and egg problem, as it seems to me. But how do we know this? I mean, how do we know from looking at other countries and their experience, and from looking back at the beginning of that chart when turnout was higher, what was different about the substance of our discourse then that leads us to believe that one or other of these theories would actually hold true in evidence? So whoever wants to jump in first civilly can do so.
Well, I do think that there's a bit of a chicken egg thing, and some of the negative things that Don is pointing to that we really need to fix, I guess somewhere where we differ is, I think that some of those are connected to the fact that we have turnout-based elections and the way in which that affects the calculations and the strategies and the behavior of the parties. It is difficult to compare across the countries. There's so many different factors involved as to why Australians may feel about what they do about a given issue. It's just hard to isolate, the different factors. What is a little easier to do is to compare the present day in Canada to 40, 50 years ago. And I do think you could say that our politics has gotten nastier as the turnout has gotten declined. It's gotten more obsessed with driving turnout down on the other party. It's gotten more focused on our base and not about reaching across to a larger cross-section of the electorate. I think all of those turnout-based strategies have become more and more pronounced, more and more toxic, and have, as I said, become this kind of reinforcing cycle where it just drives more and more people away. Fixing the Band-Aid quote-unquote fix of putting the mandatory voting in isn't going to fix all of that, but it's one part of the mix in terms of jump-starting, getting out of that cycle where it's all about turnout.
I would agree there is a chicken and egg thing here. I guess I'd like to say this, is that I don't want to just repeat what I said, but there's two things. First of all, at the risk of sounding nostalgic, when I sort of think back, and I'm old enough I can think back and remember back to the early 60s, and I was quite young, but I do remember people going out and voting. I remember the first Trudeau election when he got elected. I remember my father and my mother, how they felt about politics. They were working class people. The bottom line is something has changed. We don't feel the same about politics and politicians that we used to. We don't, I would say, I don't want to beg the question, we don't trust them, right? We don't believe in it. We don't have faith in it. I don't know what it takes to regenerate that, but it seems to me axiomatic, or not far from axiomatic, that if we used to participate in a way that we don't now, and it wasn't a golden age, it just meant people took it seriously. They took their duty seriously. They don't now, and I think it's way too simple to say that they're just apathetic. I think they have profound reasons and good evidence for saying it's BS. So I guess my question would be, how do we test this? We really ought to test it. I take Andrew's point that we don't have a lot of evidence. I showed you a chart, but it's patchy, right? It's one chart. I think we probably should try to figure out what actually is the composition out there, what kind of things are driving people. I'm going a lot on intuition and personal experience and belief. I don't have a lot else to go on, but I think that would be useful. And I guess I would say this again, the one thing I don't find convincing is when people keep citing all the good things that are happening with mandatory voting. When I look at countries where it's going on, I don't see much difference. It seems to me we easily inflate the benefits that flow from this, and there may be some, there surely are some there. What they are, I think we have yet to find out, and it would be valuable to actually conduct some research on this.
Could I just throw in just one point, and Don can respond if you like, but one indicator that might be interesting to pursue is if we look at Australia, since we're talking about it, where the turnout is more than 30 points higher than here, I don't believe it's the case that any more than a tiny fraction of that extra 30% as people marking their ballot, I reject the ballot, none of the above, spoil my ballot. Most of them actually, once they get to the polling booth, choose a party. So that to me indicates that if the notion is that people are staying away from the polls purely out of a protest vote, obviously some of them are, but if the notion is that this is essentially a protest vote, I do think the Australian experience would belie that.
Well, let me say this, is I don't think I actually agree completely with you, Andrew, when you say there's a bunch of different stuff going on here, including in one person's head. So if you take, your typical youth, whoever that may be, right, that doesn't vote, it's not like they're just sort of saying, oh, this one is apathetic and this one has a principled objection. The reality is they're living in a culture, they're experiencing politics, they form a bunch of views, some semi-consciously, some consciously, some through reflection, some not. And the bottom line is it apathy that's driving them? Is it principled stuff? The reality is, I would just say this, is at some level they become convinced finally that it's BS. And all I want to say is when I start separating the strands myself as a guy who tries to do that, I see a lot of evidence that that is true. It doesn't mean it's only true, and it doesn't mean there's not some apathy there. So I think if we were going to sort this stuff out, we got to start figuring out how are people digesting this stuff and how do we unravel it for them and make it meaningful again. And that's a complicated process.
The other question I had was how far we can speculate about what Canada would look like if we had mandatory voting. I mean, Andrew talked about this, that it wouldn't just be a wider pool voting in exactly the same ratios that we have today, but it would likely be somewhat different because the people who don't vote tend to vote differently than the people who do. If you can sort out what I just said there. It made sense in my head.
I'm going to say it back.
So I think we can assume that certain parties would do better than they do today if we had mandatory voting. But we're going off of polling, we're going off of instinct and speculation there. How far can we carry that? Don, do you want to jump in on that?
It's a great question, Kate. I actually don't have an answer. I hope I'm not sidestepping the question. I guess my instinct tells me that what would happen is we would have higher turnout for sure. I don't doubt that at all. Do I believe it would change much in the short term? I think in the short term it probably would make some difference. And this is where the fairness argument matters. I said I think it really has something to say. I think if you suddenly had mandatory voting and then Aboriginal people and people in poverty and youth were all voting, surely that would have some impact on the policy agenda. I guess all I would want to say is I don't think it solves the real problem underlying this, and any real value would be short-lived, and we would be facing the same kind of problems still in terms of alienation, distrust, and all that. It wouldn't be enough to overcome that. So my short answer is we would get a bump out of it, but it would not solve the problem, and we would lose the indicator.
Well, certainly, to take up the obvious point, yes, turnout would go up. Associated with that would be you'd have more of a claim to a mandate for a governing party. Right now, what we have is governing parties forming majorities with around 20% of the voting age population voting for them, which is about the kind of mandate that governments could claim at the beginning of the 20th century when women couldn't vote. So that's how far this is sunk. So there's a lot of other changes we want to make as well, but one part of this would be higher turnout, associated higher mandates for the governments that they could claim. Obviously, it's very difficult to forecast how things will change because you change one factor, some other things change. But I do think, yes, the evidence is that non-voters from the states, in particular non-voters, tend to skew to the left. So you would our politics would tend to move a little bit to the left, but that's democracy. Whether you're right or left, you should favor whatever it is the public wants. I think it'd be harder for people to tune out politics if everyone around them was voting. It's easier. It makes it that much easier if you're inclined to be apathetic, if you're inclined to drop out, whether because you're lazy or whether because you're disaffected by what's going on in our politics. It's easier to tune out if everyone around you is not even bothering to pay attention. If everyone around you is voting, if everyone around you is part of the conversation, I just think it gives that much more encouragement to people. I can't prove and I can't show you evidence that says that we would have a more engaged electorate, that people would, become. We're not about to become Periclean Athens. But it seems to me that voting is like other human activities, that if you practice it, you get better at it. And if you don't practice it, it atrophies. That democratic muscle atrophies. So in that non-provable sense, I put that out there as a hypothesis.
Okay, can I? Yeah. Actually, there is another thing I would like to say about this, is I've just sort of praised a little bit the fairness argument. Now let me, in the same context, tell you my concerns with it. Is when I was thinking about this a couple of weeks ago and imagining what might happen, one of the phrases that came to mind for me is that suddenly a lot of votes will be available at fire sale prices. Suppose, for example, that you're thinking about youth or Aboriginal people and you have mandatory voting and suddenly these people's votes come available. So political parties say, yay, right? There's a whole thing, a new set of votes for us to harvest. We just make a few policies and throw them at youth. We're going to do this or that from you, or Aboriginal people, and we're going to get those votes. Here's my negative thought on that, is that right now, they can't get those votes unless they work really hard, because they've got to get that person out of their chair and to the voting place and casting a ballot for them now. Now we're doing the work of pushing that person to the voter booth for them, and all they have to do is get them to mark an X on their place rather than someone else. So ultimately, it's a fire sale price. If I'm going to be there and vote anyway, I might as well take whatever I can get. And if somebody's offering me as a youth a little bit cheaper interest rates on my student loans, I might as well vote for them. And I'm not sure that's a particularly good game. Well, and I wouldn't be at all surprised that would be a consequence.
Just, if I may, just quickly, embedded in that is the idea that they're working hard for people's votes now in some kind of positive, life-affirming way. I.e., making positive proposals for democratic change. What they're in fact doing all too often is as I mentioned earlier, doing their best to inflame people with the idea that the other side are spawn of Satan. And unless we stop them from getting to power, and help us stop so-and-so from doing X, is the tone of every appeal now. When it's not, when turnout isn't as urgent a matter as it is, then I think you're more likely to have a politics of, here's the policies we're proposing, can we tempt you away from that party to this party, without it being, this is wartime and therefore all measures are justified, which is the attitude most people in politics have now.
I guess I'd want to say this is, I don't get the last word, but let me get the last word.
Roland hasn't brought up their book yet, so.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah.
Yes?
No, go ahead.
Oh, all right. I may have just lost my train of thought. I was just going to say this, is that while it's true that if you had people suddenly, all Aboriginal people and all those people who are now non-voting parties showing up, I think it's certainly true that the kind of voter suppression and so on that might be going on, or even ignoring those people, would happen less. But I think a whole bunch of the same sort of strategies, dividing and conquering in all kinds of ways, would just get played out in a new way with a different group of people. In other words, I don't see this changing the political culture. I don't see any evidence to think this is going to change how political parties behave. In fact, it may make it worse for all I know. And it seems to me that's the thing we should be caring about. Not whether we get more people out, but whether in the end of the day, the meaningfulness of voting actually is there again, so people are consenting and making choices based upon a belief that they actually care about the system and the people they're choosing.
So I think it is time for us to move to our audience questions. And while we're doing that, I have a couple of requests. First of all, don't do as I have done and preface your questions with a preamble. Don't be like me. And so please keep your questions short if you can. And please do use the microphones, because we do have people recording this, and if you don't use the microphones, it's just going to show up as nothing at all but static. So they are at each side. And while I hope the first person moves there, I'm curious to see a show of hands, and I don't really want to see a show of hands about who's winning, because that's boring. But has anyone here feel that they've had their mind changed or nudged in one direction or the other from when they came into the room an hour ago?
Or indeed both directions.
Yeah, exactly. Well, look at that.
That's fun.
There you go. And do we have anyone who wants to go to the microphone? Or should I keep babbling, which I want to do? Here we are.
Well, I certainly found the debate thus far absolutely stimulating. I wondered one element that neither of you have raised, and that is the role or potential of referenda. As many in this audience will know, the U.S. elections in midterm, several states had the opportunity to vote on very select questions, and then some national states like Switzerland, for example, will use it to address questions that are in the national interest, above and beyond the political element. I perhaps to pose to both of you, do you see a role for the use of referendum, either to bolster your argument or not?
I do. I think they can be overused, and I think in some U.S. states they get to the point where it just is too much to load onto people. But I don't see it, as some people do, as being some sort of assault on parliamentary prerogatives or a derogation from representative democracy. The way I view it is, the public are like the chief executive, let's say, of a company, where if he or she is smart, they'll delegate authority to their subordinates, their hirelings, to work on the day-to-day tasks, but they retain the right, the prerogative, to make the big decisions, again, if they're smart. So, to take the analogy, we delegate responsibility for the day-to-day government of the country, the people we elect, the people we hire, but there's nothing in that says that we can't take back the right to make the big decisions if we so choose. So I am a supporter of referendums, for example, on constitutional amendments. I'm a supporter of referendums on tax increases, and I'm a supporter of citizens' initiatives, probably, as long as you have a high enough bar, so it's not just every other interest group triggering a referendum. But I do think they can make for a more engaged, to come to your point about this particular debate, they can make for a more engaged and informed electorate, because it becomes part of your universe that I have to think about these things. And I'll give you the example, is the 1988 free trade election, which was the nearest thing you're going to see to a referendum election. And I remember I was writing for a business paper at the time, and the Financial Post, and we had been writing about nothing but free trade for the last 18 months. It was the biggest issue to ever hit Canada. And a month before the election, 3 weeks before the election, we were getting people phoning us up and writing us saying, "What's all this about free trade? Why haven't you told us anything about free trade?" Now, you can take that as a signal of the ignorance of the average voter, if you like, and I'm okay with that. But what's, I think, equally interesting is, in that last several weeks, you saw a national cram session when it dawned on people of, oh my goodness, I have to make this choice. I can't just blame it on Mulrooney or blame it on whoever. I'm going to be implicated here in the future of my country, one way or the other. And I think you saw people step up in a big way. And there's all kinds of amazing anecdotes for any of you who were around at the time of people, reading the copy of the agreement on the bus. People took it immensely seriously. And so I do think people step up if you let them. If you treat them like adults, they become adults. If you treat them like children, they become children.
Yeah, I'd like to say something just quick because I agree with just about everything, in fact, pretty much everything Andrew said. I'd just like to unpack it a little bit further on one thing that I alluded to earlier, but I want to make more explicit. I would draw a distinction between aggregation, got to use some technical stuff here, aggregation and deliberation. Aggregation in voting or referendum or something is when you simply say how many people said yes, how many people said no, and let the most yeses get it, right? And my concern over referendum, of course, is the sort of populist stuff that really is just about aggregating public opinion. In other words, we're just going to ask everybody what they think. We can give you a button to push, and then we will take the highest number of votes and they win. And lots of people favor this stuff. I don't like this stuff at all. I would say referendums, if they are genuinely blended with deliberation, so that there's a real discussion, as Andrew pointed on, and people are, their views are transforming and developing and being exchanged, I don't have a problem with it at all. In fact, I guess I'd say this, if it turned out that encouraged them to have deliberative discussions, I might be really in favor of referendum. My big fear is they turn into aggregative things that are actually isolationist and I think not very productive and not very thoughtful.
We have a question over on this side.
Well, mine is not so much a question as a comment I'd like your opinion on.
You can end it with a, wouldn't the minister agree?
Yeah.
Because I've been thinking about it ever since the first meeting that didn't happen, is that neither position answers the question that, basically we're the employers and we should have more power to choose and fire the employees with regards to politicians. And basically, in my opinion, is that non-votes, if you want to call people who don't vote, non-votes and canceled votes should be automatically counted as a vote against the choices available. And if those non-votes and canceled votes are a greater number than that of the leading party, one is that leading party should get only a 2-year mandate as opposed to the current 4. And then secondly, the leaders of both leading parties should be forced to resign and for a new leader to step up for the next election. That would force the leaders to offer real choices and real vision for the country instead of offering us crumbs. And it would also definitely answer the problem of vote suppression.
You want to take that first, Don? Go ahead.
Well, first of all, I'm not sure where this fits in the mandatory voting thing. It sounds to me we're moving more into parliamentary reform or political reform or something like that. I'm not sure if I'm right about that, or maybe, am I missing the point?
No, basically, it's basically thinking out of the box. And very often we're so stuck with one idea, and basically, if none is particularly satisfactory, we need to move to something else.
Here's my short answer, and it's just a slight variation on what I said about aggregation deliberation, is what I certainly do think, whether you're talking about political parties or policy development, again, I do lots of policy development, and I do it with groups of people, is the idea of having a process that is more bottom-up, and I agree with Andrew, it shouldn't be just bottom-up. People have to make decisions. We elect people to make decisions. But if we actually have processes, whether it's through governments or political parties or others, that allow for structured deliberation, exchanges of ideas, and development of ideas, I think that's a very good thing. And any time I have done that and it's worked, people have been more than satisfied. They don't have to have the last word. They just want to feel like they had a meaningful say, and at the end of the day, what they had to say gets registered with the people who finally make decisions. If you're playing in that ballpark, I'm completely supportive.
This is very interesting. I don't have anything particular to say about your exact proposal. I'd have to think about it. But where I think you're going with this, which is interesting to me, is you're saying there should be some sort of penalty for the lot of them if the turnout falls below a certain level.
Yeah.
And that gets at the nub of one of the things that I was talking about, which is that they each have an incentive to maximize their own turnout, but to minimize everybody else's turnout. Nobody has an incentive or a mandate to look out for turnout as a whole. And if there were, and that's a big if, but if there were some way to have some sort of incentives or penalties built into the system where how the overall turnout, what the overall turnout is, affects your well-being, your welfare as a party leader, as a party, that would be really interesting to think about. The problem, of course, is how do you get from here to there? How do you get people who have a vested interest in the present system to ever move towards a system where they'd be facing some kind of jeopardy if collectively they let the turnout fall? But it gets at this point is often made about negative ads. That you don't see the same kind of really harshly negative ads in other industries, if you will. If Air Canada and their competitors, WestJet, et cetera, ran ads about how often the other guy's planes crashed, nobody would fly in any of them, right? So they somehow have worked their way to some kind of collective understanding that we got to keep our advertising within some kind of reasonable bounds, or the whole industry is done. Politics hasn't reached that same level of understanding.
I just want to just add a very brief comment, because I didn't quite hear that, but I mean, I like what Andrew said, and I think if there was some way to actually create a benchmark that tested people on these things, and if there was a penalty to pay, that might be very useful. I would have to think about how you could actually get them to do it, but I think probably you could make arguments that would potentially could convince leaders that in the long run this is in their interest to do it, rather than losing immediate power or losing immediate authority.
Well, part of it too is that if you don't have that level, it's basically you're winning with a minority sort of, you were talking about winning with 20% of the vote. That's like a minority support. It's not a majority support. So if you have a minority support, the idea of having a mandate of 2 years is basically the most you're usually going to get from a minority government.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very interesting, too, to think about how that would differ with federal party politics versus municipal politics, where you see Jim Watson. What would Jim Watson do to get more turnout when he's already got 75% of the people who do vote? So that's interesting.
That's an excellent point.
On this side.
Hi, thank you very much for today. Russell Brand, New Statesman. Just wondering what you think, talking about thinking out of the box, thinking way out of the box. The kids are listening. He says, don't vote, impassioned arguments, the system is broken. He's one of the most popular video, YouTube policy people who's talking to youth.
That puts me on the spot. What do I think about that? I was dead serious when I said to you folks that I flirt with the idea that politics is worthless, that it's not worth the time. I'm sorry to say it, it's true. Which brings me to the heart of your question. If I really thought that, would I say to others, don't vote, it's so broken we can't fix it? I guess I'm far enough that it worries me a lot, but I'm not so far that I'm prepared to give up hope. And my argument is we can still fix this, but it ain't going to be easy. So I guess my immediate answer is no, I don't think that's a good thing. I don't think it's a good thing to tell people not to vote.
I don't think it would have the effect that he's claiming, but I'd rather have a mechanism where people could go in and vote and say, I reject all of you. That to me is, then we know what your purpose was. Then we know that you were protesting. Right now, we don't know whether you're protesting or just having a beer.
And how can we counter that message? In other words, that's what's appealing, Well, and there's the presentation and the content.
And there's a positive side of this, and Don kind of, I think, touched on it briefly, which is that is a challenge. It's a positive challenge to politics, which is that people have discovered there's lots of other ways to make your views known and to be active and to try and make a better society than just through the political arena. And that's all the good. There should be competition, both within politics and between politics and other realms. That's all the good. But again, it doesn't have to be either or. People can be involved in Greenpeace or whatever their different groups are, and also when it comes to larger decisions than just that particular question that they're supporting through that activist group, but the larger questions of the social good, they can also be involved in political parties.
Thanks.
Go over to this side of the room.
Thank you. This was touched on towards the end, but I'd just like to ask it explicitly. If mandatory voting were implemented, do you see it benefiting one political party over another? And if so, do you see that as a barrier to it ever being adopted?
Yes and yes.
In the short term, it would definitely be to the detriment of, as I think it would be to the detriment of right-of-center parties. Parties tend, however, to adjust to different circumstances. They are in the vote-getting game, and I don't think you can assume everyone would just carry on as before. It's the same reason why when people do these things where, what if we merged the Liberal and the NDP parties, and wouldn't that just make sure that they would win all the elections? Well, no, because then the Conservatives would change, and they would change, and the electorate would change. So I think you can distinguish between short-run impacts and long-run impacts, which have to do with what if we got everybody engaged in politics more than they are now, would their views change? Would a non-voter's views that are now saying the whole world's corrupt, nobody's got any answers, would they have a slightly different view if they got involved with a thing and say, oh, actually, there's some good people with goodwill here who actually have some interesting proposals. Maybe I should listen a little more carefully.
I'm just happy with yes, and I think Andrew's right. Is that my best guess is that it would, in the short term, it would disadvantage parties on the right, if nothing else, the youth vote, right? And that for that reason it would be difficult. But I think there is a longer term, and I suspect politicians, in a good way, being politicians, would adjust. They'd have to adjust very quickly to a new world. And I think that's, again, to go back to this thing about the fairness vote and so on, once that was a reality, people would start thinking differently. I think it's an interesting question when they start thinking longer term, how would this actually play out in terms of transforming the practices that are now in place? And that's where I become pretty skeptical. I think some things are going to change, but I don't think that's going to fundamentally change the way politics is conducted and the political culture around us.
I should say, I don't necessarily think the right of center party would move to the left to chase those voters. But they would actually have to come up with a message that appealed to them directly. So I would hope, because I like seeing distinct alternatives. I'd like to see good distinct left parties and good distinct right parties. I would hope they would say, how can we take our basic philosophical message and make it more appealing to young people? How do we reach out to young people? How do we reach out to Aboriginal people? Right now, they don't even have to bother. And they don't invest the same kind of effort and attention they do to that they do to their target groups, which is also the same with the left-wing parties. Everyone just focuses on their own base.
Hi. So I was just wondering, Mr. Coyne, I guess maybe if you could comment about, maybe from a historical perspective, about why you think that mandatory voting, let's say, was left out of the British North America Act 1867, United States Constitution, and the Charter of Rights, maybe even going back, let's see, to the Magna Carta, and these constitutional documents. Why do you think that the founding father, John A. Macdonald, George Etienne Cartier, they left out mandatory voting as a requirement of citizenship, let's say, as a British subject, going back to now, of course, with the Charter of Rights with Pierre Trudeau?
I don't know. Maybe it's a bad idea and they were wise enough to see it and avoided it. Or maybe it just didn't occur to them. Certainly, Australia was, as I'm aware, Australia was the first place on earth that did it, and that was in 1924. So it had not really, I think, become part of the currency of conversation, as far as I'm aware, unless Don can tell me that John Stuart Mill proposed it in some obscure document somewhere. But.
Well, I can't say that, but what I would say is this, is if you look back, of course, at the early stages of democracy, is the really powerful, or the big emphasis was on liberty. I would be surprised if somewhere along the line people like John Stuart Mill or John Locke or whomever didn't raise this question. It must have got raised when they thought about voting. But my guess is that their views on liberty were so strong that they wouldn't have foreseen the kind of arguments we're having. They would have just thought that ultimately your choice. In fact, let me go one step back and say John Locke did argue this, that ultimately the most fundamental thing about voting is consent. And I think he probably would have said, as I want to say sometimes, you can't force a person to make a choice on that. Is that when you're consenting through a vote, the most important part of what you're doing isn't the choice you make. That matters. That's your trade-off. You get to make a choice because you consent. But you're consenting to submit to the authority of government. And that's what you're really doing there is limiting your own liberty in exchange for the benefits of living under that government and the benefits of being able to make a choice. And my guess is they probably would have seen mandatory voting as simply inconsistent with that.
I should add, if we want to go right back to the source, that in ancient Athens, attendance at the theater in Athens was compulsory.
This is true.
And the theater was not just the theater as we think of it as, let's go for a nice night out. It was where the debates of the day, the political debates of the day were played out. So in that sense, they did have a kind of compulsory politics, if not compulsory voting.
I just want to say they got to drink in the theater, too.
All right. Thanks a lot. Appreciate that.
Over here.
Some of the more common arguments that you hear for people who choose not to vote is that, as both of you had mentioned, I just don't see myself represented by the parties, or my vote simply doesn't count. And I would argue that that is largely a symptom of the first past the post electoral system that we have. I was just wondering if both of you could talk a little bit to the role that electoral reform could play perhaps in increasing voter turnout. And then I guess to follow up on that, if you think that there's still an appetite for that discussion, considering the turnout of the last 4 referenda that there were at the provincial level, if there's still an appetite for that discussion, both at the provincial and the federal levels?
Well, you're singing my song. It is absolutely true that there are many different ways in which the first past the post system limits people's choices and discourages them from voting. If you live, for example, in a safe riding, which first past the post tends to encourage, because if you can agglomerate your vote geographically, you have all kinds of advantages. So if you live in a safe riding, what's the point of voting? If you don't vote for anybody but the winning candidate, you may well say, what's the point? I'm not going to be represented. They got 30% of the vote in the riding, but they get 100% of the representation for their party. So that's a discouragement to people to vote. If you're told that there's such a danger of split voting that you can't actually vote for the candidate you like, you have to vote for a candidate you dislike in order to keep a candidate you detest from getting in, that's a discouragement for people to vote. They're going to say, well, you've got a gun to my head. So there's 1,000 different ways, and maybe the biggest one, the one that gets overlooked, I think, is the way it affects politicians' behavior. What first past the post, the most salient aspect of it is it's a kind of leveraged system. It's not for nothing, it's called a winner-take-all system. You get a 2% swing in the vote nationwide, and you get a 60-seat swing in your number of seats in the House. And that puts politicians on a knife edge. And they behave the way people standing on a knife edge all day long will behave. They're very risk averse. They have these long periods where nobody says anything or takes any chances. And then we have this kind of frenzy of wedge issues that we call elections, where they dangle things in front of the right groups to try and get them motivated to go to the polls. And it's all because they're going after this, these small slivers of the vote, rather than treating every vote equally, every riding equally, and every region equally, which is one of the essences of a more proportional system, whichever one you want to choose. So all of those being said, yeah, I absolutely think that's an important element if we're discussing positive ways to encourage people to vote. I'm pessimistic in the short run that we're going to see much change in that direction. New Democrats that I know assure me that if they were to be elected, they would pursue proportional representation. I remain skeptical that any party that was elected under the current system would actually change it, but I may be proven wrong on that. The Liberals have proposed ranked balloting, which is not proportional, but at least is something other than the status quo. And that's the glimmer of optimism I have, is not so much at the federal or even provincial level, where, as you say, we've had some defeats in the recent past, although the first referendum in BC passed by any rational definition of passage. But at the municipal level. And again, if Ontario, I'm not sure where the legislation is at, but I think it's somewhere in the second reading stage that they're going to bring in legislation allowing cities, including Toronto, which has asked for this, to bring in ranked balloting. As I say, that's not proportional representation. It doesn't fix all our problems, but it gets us over this hump of there is no other system except the one we have. Why would we ever want to change it? Once we have a living, breathing, working model on Canadian soil, of something other than first past the post, so that you can't have this instant objection of we will turn into Israel or Italy, then I think we can have a more informed and more mature debate. So that's what's given me some optimism on that front.
Actually, I wonder if I could take just a bit of a different tack on this. Seems I think a lot of what Andrew said makes sense to me. But we had a question about referendum, and I think that Andrew's comments in his opening comments about the stupid person thing, right? Whether stupid people should be allowed to vote or not. Yes, they should. There's a really interesting lesson I think we can draw from the experience of the Citizens' Assembly in BC and Ontario. Everybody familiar with that? On electoral reform? Just in case anybody isn't, I forget what it was now, 6 or 7 or 8 years ago, I don't know how long, I'm getting old. But there were 2 Citizens' Assembly on electoral reform, one in BC and one in Ontario. And they brought people from across the province to both of them. They had the politicians, to their credit, stepped back, let these people come together with a group in a very powerful process with a group of experts and other things, and see, A, did they want to change their electoral system? And B, if they did, what would that new electoral system look like? And the governments in both cases agreed that if they could come to agreement on those 2 questions, it would go to the people in a referendum in the next election. Here's what was really interesting in both cases. In BC, by the way, if you remember, came very close. They had to get a supermajority and fell just short of it. They went to a second ballot and fell a little bit more short. But in both cases, at the end of the day, the general view was the reason it failed was not because people didn't want proportional representation. It was because they couldn't understand the system which was created, which turned out to be different in BC and different in Alberta. And I think in Ontario. I think there's a really important lesson here if we want to do referendums and engagement processes and things like this, and about the role that citizens should have in that. What they should have done in both cases is this. They should have said citizens will come in Part A of this process, and what they will do is they will tell us, do you think your system is fair from the point of your electoral system? And if not, what kind of system do you think would be more fair? This is something that citizens can judge on, right? They do have values and they can make priorities and assessments and so on, and they could come back and say, you know what, first past the post is crap, so we want something else, and it's got to be some kind of mixed system with proportional representation. What we should have done then is brought in a bevy of experts, 20 experts from across the province, and told them, this is not about you, this is about what citizens just told you. We now want the 20 of you guys to sit down in this room, and you're not going to leave until you sort out the best possible system that you can all agree upon. And then when that happened, those 20 experts with different points of view could have stood up arm in arm and said to the public generally, trust us, this is the best you're going to get. If you want proportional representation, trust us. And with 20 of them doing that, my guess is a whole bunch of people would have said, good enough for me. The problem was all these people who were your next door neighbor were redesigning the electoral system, and they couldn't explain it. And everybody just sort of said, wow, I don't know what that is, too complicated for me. So we lost credibility on that. There's nothing that says we couldn't divide responsibilities in referendums and processes like that to have citizens make judgments on the big broad things like priorities and values and other things like that, and experts to build on that, to use citizens' direction to build a system that actually works.
Now, all of that being said, and that point, all those points being well taken, in BC in that first referendum,
came very close.
They got 58% in favor. They got a majority, I think it was all but 2 of the electoral districts. They just fell short of the 60% bar that the government had set for this. You know, the government, which was elected by what, 42% of the public?
We have 2 people at the microphones, and I'm going to hold it to, you can ask your questions, but then that'll be the end. We seem to have nicely decided, you know, en masse as Canadians do, that we would have the right number of people at the microphones. So we'll go over to this side.
As we're moving to the end, I'm thinking a lot about the rights and responsibilities of citizenship, and what you said, Mr. Coyne, before about exercising the democratic muscle, and Mr. Lenahan, using that analogy, the voting or mandatory voting, I mean that muscle, the voting muscle is only one muscle in the whole, say, corpus of muscles that make up citizenship. What are other ways that we can increase the health of Canadian citizenship? Because I think there's a fear of focus determining reality, and you know, we think politics is horrible, so we turn it down, but we don't. Are we losing focus on the strength of Canadian citizenship and what it means to be a citizen, what it means to engage in civic duties or civic responsibilities? And sort of as a little add-on, I just finished, I see Susan Delacourt's in there, I was reading Shopping for Votes, and I was thinking, you know, in terms of micro-targeting is something that still goes on, you know, is being used in Australia, even though they're mandatory voting, and sort of the 24-hour news cycle and tweeting and all that sort of, that echo chamber also plays a role in focus and citizenship and public debate. And are there fixes that can be made there? Are they complementary to voting? How can they help whether or not we have mandatory voting?
So that seems like Don's wheelhouse in particular, although I know we'll have comments on both sides. You want to start on that, Don?
Well, actually, I think I can be fairly brief here. Is that I love the question. If I had 2 hours, I'd like to talk about it. But let me just say this. First of all, I think there's all kinds of things we can do. At the risk of opening up the debate with Andrew again, the more I looked at mandatory voting, the more it convinced me, not that it can't do good things, but most of what it can be done in other ways. So if we lose something by bringing mandatory voting in, why wouldn't we just do it in another way? And that's a discussion to be had. But it just turned, I mean, whether we're talking about better education, whether we're talking about various kinds of laws and restrictions on advertising for political parties, I think there's lots of things that we could do that would build into the political culture to change it and strengthen citizenship. My own hobby horse, surprise, surprise, would be to say this, is that what citizens really want is they want to know that their voice is meaningful, and they want to know that that their views are being taken seriously, being considered and weighed and taken seriously. And I think that the most egregious thing about our political system right now is that it really doesn't do that. It doesn't do that in a profound way. People feel like they aren't heard, they aren't listened to, they see no accountability, no transparency. I think what we ought to be doing from the ground up in political parties is finding ways to bring people into those processes that they find meaningful. And I want to be really clear, I'm not arguing for a moment that everything should be citizen engagement and we should have people speaking on everything in long drawn out processes. I don't think that at all. But I think we've got to find a balance where people feel like they genuinely have have some input, their voice is being heard, and that it's meaningful, and they see at the end of the day they made a difference. And we can do that. We could do that. That's why I don't give up on politics.
I'll take a somewhat narrow definition of citizenship to focus on citizens as political engagers. There's other aspects of citizenship beyond politics and beyond voting, but just to stick somewhat close to our last. I think there's two broad areas of reform we need, one to do with elections, one to do with Parliament. I'll throw out a couple of things for sort of fun ideas for fixing our elections, and on two of the things that people most complain about. One is the politicians lie to us constantly, and that's not just a populist know-nothing complaint, it's true. We've seen election after election where politicians are elected on a central campaign promise and do the exact opposite as soon as they're in power. And that's just absolutely corrosive of public trust. So one of the things I've sort of toyed with is, well, you know, when you think about it, the real danger of that isn't so much that the cheaters prosper, it's that the good guys, the people who are telling the truth, they're not being believed either. So how do we fix that? How do we get it so a politician who's actually on the level can protest their bona fides to people that they'll be believed? Well, what do we do in private life? Well, we have things like swearing on affidavits, or we have bonded couriers. We have these kinds of ways that people can voluntarily take on legal obligations if they prove to be lying, if they prove to be frauds. Similarly, we have things where, where if you issue a prospectus to issue stock, not only can you not lie, you can't even be misleading. There's all kinds of rules around it. Well, what if we had a system, therefore? I'm not talking about truth police or anybody going around and playing gotcha with campaign slips of the lip. But supposing a politician who really had something important they wanted to say and wanted to make sure everyone got that they were on the level about it, for example, with their platform, if they could voluntarily assume some kind of legal liability, they could opt in to legal liability in the process. I think that's something that's worth exploring. On attack ads, which is the other big complaint that people have, and so much of our campaigns now are just drowning in this kind of, not criticism, which is perfectly fair, but this kind of corrosive, inflammatory types of attack ads. You've seen, of course, in the States where they have this thing where you have to come on at the end and say, I'm John McCain and I approve this message. And it hasn't really worked, but what if you took it one step further, which I would support, which is make the candidates voice the ads. And there's actually a private member's bill in front of Parliament now, I'm pleased to see, that's proposing something along these lines. So you can say what you like. There's no implication for free speech. You can attack your opponent in any language you want to. You just have to own it. And the problem we have right now, of course, is the candidate or the leader can kind of sail along at this level and say, oh, I'm just talking about the greater good and what my vision, my positive vision for the country, while his minions are doing the dirty work. This destroys and collapses that deniability and makes them take account for what's said in their name. So there's a couple of things there with elections. I won't get into the broad thing of Parliament, but it starts and it ends with assigning more responsibility and autonomy to the members of Parliament that we elect, to having more tight connection between the member of Parliament, their accountability to their riding, their ability to speak for that riding and to speak for their own individual consciences and not always have to be answerable to the party in Parliament. And there's a whole range of reforms we can make on that. 2 quick points. I hate micro-targeting. I think it's a cancer in our democracy. It's restored to the parties what had been taken away from them by the mass media. It used to be the old game in Canada that you said one thing to one group of voters and you said something entirely different to another group of voters, and you just trusted that they wouldn't ever get a chance to compare notes. Right now we've got messages tailored down to, Susan Delacour could tell you all the details, right down to the local, your own house. You can have a different message for each house on the block. And they have all this data they've compiled on you. And I'm not saying we should outlaw it, but I don't know why we enable it. I don't know why Elections Canada provides them with all the data they need for this. I don't know why we give them all the money we do for this. It's never been easier to communicate with large numbers of people at lower cost. Email blasts and websites, they cost next to nothing. And yet we've never spent more on our politics, most of it for this kind of damaging, nasty, negative stuff. So take away the money and take away the enabling aspects of it. The last point, just about mandatory voting and how it can contribute to all this, beyond all that we've been discussing, is the fact that it's mandatory, the fact that it's a discipline, the fact that it's something we have to do, it's a burden, it's something put upon us. We devalue that aspect of membership in things. We are always perpetually trying to win people to things by giving them stuff. How can we sell federalism? Well, we can give them stuff. And we do this, and we have this idea that that's how you win people's loyalty. But when you think about it, the organizations and the groups and the affiliations that we have that really really call upon our loyalty are the ones that ask things of us, the ones that demand things of us. Right? If you've ever, an army unit or your team or your church, they ask things, they demand things of us. And we haven't, I think, emphasized that aspect of citizenship enough. I'm not saying anything beyond mandatory voting. I'm not talking about national service. But mandatory voting is a pretty small thing that nevertheless says, okay, my country is asking something of me here.
Well, thank you for this. There's an ownership element here too in this debate. So thank you for giving this space, this sort of public space to exercise in that way.
Last question.
I'm just wondering if you both could speculate about what's going on the East Coast, because voter turnout is still much better on the East Coast than it is in Central Canada, and I'm just wondering what's different. I mean, there's no mandatory voting, so what's the difference in Eastern Canada?
This is speculation, obviously. I mean, I just think as a guy who travels out there a lot and works out there with in lots of different communities, and I spent a year in New Brunswick doing public engagement processes for the government, it just struck me how much collegial, how much more collegial they still are, how much more community-based they are. I know it's a cliche, but it's true, right? I just think the sense of community, the sense of public spiritedness, the sense of sharing things makes a difference, and their communities are more real to them. I think they just have a bigger interest in them. Maybe part of that is size. You don't have the same big communities like Toronto or something, but I think there's definitely a lesson to be learned there, is that having a sense of belonging and membership and ownership is critical to fulfilling the duties that Andrew talked about. And people are quite willing to fulfill duties if they see they're meaningful duties and that they're actually, they link up to something. Just asking them to perform a duty when they don't really know where it goes is kind of a wasted effort.
I should say it's declining there too, but it is higher in some of those provinces than others. PEI in particular has the highest. Some of the others are not doing quite as well. I'm not sure if it's necessarily an Eastern Canadian thing, because Saskatchewan also has relatively high turnout, and so it may be more a small province, or indeed a province with close community connections. And I think that to some extent that validates my argument about, you vote because people around you are voting, because you can see people going to the polling stations, and it kind of reminds you that this is part of your civic duty. There's a lot of discussion around electronic voting. Should we have people voting online, and would that encourage people to vote more? And there's some interesting data out of, I think it's Switzerland, where when they tried a pilot project on this, the turnout actually went down. And people sort of puzzled about this. And one of the theses is, when you're just sitting there over your computer, you don't have the same peer pressure. If you live in a close-knit community where you're interacting with people, which more describes Switzerland perhaps than some North American locales. But oh, hello, Mrs. Jones, you're on the way to vote. You just have this interaction where it becomes part of the currency of, oh, that's what we do. That's what we do together. So that's one of the factors one wants to take into consideration when we're discussing electronic voting, is, are we losing that communal, almost reverential thing of going and voting in this kind of solemn ceremony? It's a little bit like, as somebody said, the difference between, watching church on TV and going to church. They're two very different things.
Thanks very much. So we have 2 minutes each, and we will start with Don for concluding remarks.
Thanks. I didn't really prepare any concluding remarks because I didn't know where this was going to end up. So let me first of all just say, I want to remind you of 3 points that to me are the core of why I feel opposed at the end of the day to mandatory voting. First of all, in my view, it eliminates the clearest indicator we have of political legitimacy. I think that's a huge price to pay. I care about measurement, I care about clarity, I care about transparency. Secondly, it uses artificially high numbers to mask the loss of trust. Once you have these big, 90% turnouts, then the question of the loss of trust just gets lost somewhere back there. There's nothing that magnifies and amplifies it. And finally, I think maybe, I don't know if this is the worst of the 3, it gives political parties and leaders an excuse to continue with the business that they're doing. Business as usual. And I think that's the thing that worries me most, is it will take a lot to challenge the kind of things we've been talking about, a lot of will and a lot of clarity. And the less clarity we have about the state of our democracy, the less willing I think political parties will be to do anything about it. Let me conclude just by saying this, is that at the risk of getting melodramatic here, I remember I read a book many years ago that left a huge impression on me, and it was by a political scientist, and the argument he made is there's really only 2 kinds of government in the world. There are authoritarian governments and there are democracies. And there are lots of different kinds of authoritarian governments. There are monarchies, there are dictators, there are oligarchies, all sorts of blended models of everything in between. The thing we really have to keep sight of and it's easy for us to lose sight of this, is 99% of the history of humankind was authoritarian governments, folks. Much of the world today is still authoritarian governments. And democracy is on a continuum there. It's a sliding scale. I have little doubt that 25 years from now we will still have formally a parliamentary democracy. But it's entirely possible to have a Potemkin parliamentary democracy. And I think we got to take this really seriously. I think we're heading down a road that is worrying is an understatement. It's scary. I don't want to be melodramatic, but I just think we really do have to be vigilant about democracy. We have to recognize that if we don't call our leaders to account, if we don't make them do the right things, if we don't stand up for it, we very well could lose it. It's a blip on the radar screen of history. The last thing I say is that Andrew mentioned micro-targeting. I don't have time now to explain what it is. Let me just say that's the next big wave. We ain't seen nothing yet. The tools coming around are huge, powerful, and potentially very good, potentially very scary. So I just say we got to be vigilant.
Well, just to recap the main points, voluntary voting, the problem, if I can put it this way, with voluntary voting, like the voluntary census, is that it produces a non-representative sample. It's not just that it's a smaller turnout, it's a skewed turnout. And it's skewed towards the sort of people most likely to vote, let's say particular social groups are more heavily represented than others, and so are certain types of voters that the parties have eagerly targeted. Voting, while it is an act of individual choice, is not confined to an individual realm of preference, like choosing a soft drink. Rather, it's the individual's contribution to an important collective activity, indeed the most important of them all, voting, choosing a government. Given the well-known dangers of free riding, it's acceptable to compel people, in my view, to vote to the minimum extent necessary, and I think we discussed and agreed that this is a pretty minimal intrusion on people's liberty. As for the objection that not so much that we'd be forcing people to vote, but as some would have it, that we're in effect letting a lot of ignorant, uninformed people into the game, I don't see any evidence that that's in fact what would happen, or that that's in fact the difference between the voters and non-voters, but even if it were true, so be it. In a democracy, everybody gets to vote, not just the ones the parties see in their interest to pursue. To take up Don's main point, shouldn't we be leaving declining turnout as a warning signal to politicians to clean up their act? I'll just very quickly summarize my differences with Don on this, that his view is that people, when they're not voting, are engaging in a kind of active protest to delegitimize the system. I think it's unclear that that is the reason why they're not voting. I think they have other ways to protest and to register that dissatisfaction than just not voting. And it's not at all clear to me that politicians are taking that signal the way that Don hopes they will, and then going to clean up their act. In fact, if anything, the opposite seems to be the case, that this dynamic of falling turnout leads to more and more of these strategy games being played and just makes the situation worse. Finally, stress this point, I can't stress this point enough, there's any number of other reforms that we can and should introduce to make our politics less trivial and to make voting more meaningful. These are not opposites to mandatory voting, but complements. We don't have to choose between them. We can do both. Mandatory voting isn't the solution to all of our democratic problems, but it is the solution to one of them, falling turnout. So let's fix that, and then let's work on fixing the others. Thank you very much.
So this vote is not mandatory, but could I have a show of hands for people who feel that we should institute mandatory voting in Canada at this point? Okay, and a show of hands of people who feel we should not. All right, so it looked like from where I was studying, a slight majority for should. Is that what we saw? Yeah.
That's skewed sample.
Yeah, exactly. So, but definitely not an overwhelming victory. So I want to thank everybody for coming out, especially those people who came out twice. Thank you very much for coming. Which wasn't Andrew, it was me. And I want to thank Roland and CIPS for hosting us tonight. It's been a really informative and thought-provoking debate. And finally, could I get another round of applause for Don Lenahan and Andrew Coyne?